The book of Genesis opens with the words, "In the beginning," and goes on to describe how God brought into existence the universe, our world, and everything living on it, including mankind. But is this magnificent story the literal truth, or is it a fanciful tale designed to be understood by people thousands of years ago? Today, we will look at the biblical story of creation, compare it to what modern science tells us, and find out where the Catholic Church stands on a topic which has become one of theology's most divisive issues. I'm Carolyn Morrison, your host, welcoming you to another episode of Mysteries of the Church.
One of the most amazing stories we're ever going to read in all of sacred scripture comes from the book of Genesis and its first and second chapters, the story of creation.
Well, we have to remember that probably the Genesis story about creation was probably put into writing perhaps 600 years before Christ, 500 years before Christ. So obviously it's not an eyewitness account. It's not meant to be history. It's not meant to be science. It comes out of a community of faith, the community of ancient Israel.
In a certain sense, the narratives at the beginning of the book of Genesis tell us not how God created, but why God created in the way that God created.
The Bible has many different literary genres, many different literary forms, and the literary genre in which chapters 1 to 11 is written is myth. Now, by saying myth, it's very important that we realize that when we say that word, we don't mean falsehood. We don't mean a story that's a fairy tale. We mean something that's true for me, true for you, true for all people, in all cultures, in all places, at all times.
For many, many centuries, Christians simply assumed that the account of creation in the early chapters of the book of Genesis were to be taken absolutely literally. It's now regularly assumed by members of the Catholic Church and by most other Christian denominations that the point of those early chapters in the book of Genesis is to teach that all that is comes from a loving, saving, creating God, but that the details, such as 6 days of creation and a seventh day of rest, are not to be understood literally.
Our universe is probably 14 billion years old. Our planet is probably 4 billion years old, etc. And only the past couple of million years, we've been around. So that's the important thing for our understanding of this. It's not necessarily that we have to hold to this idea of these 7 days of creation, and on this day this happened. We don't mean 24-hour periods.
The book of Genesis never tells us how God does that in terms of the laws of nature or in terms of the laws of physics, but speaks about the will of God to bring the universe into being. And so God can rightly be called the creator of all things on the basis of the book of Genesis, and likewise on the basis of what scientists tell us about the origins of the universe.
There was an astronomer out in California named Edwin Hubble who would stay up night after night painstakingly making photographs of the constellations and the stars. And he came to realize after a while that the photographic plates indicated that in fact the universe is expanding. And from his calculations of the expansion of the universe, it was concluded that therefore there was a time when this expansion was coming from a single point, or what is sometimes called a singularity. And generally today, that's been calculated at roughly 14 billion years.
So we now know that while the opening chapters of Genesis may not be literally true, they do describe God's plan for creating the universe. In the next segment, we will look at people who continue to accept Genesis as the literal truth and see how their belief is viewed by the Catholic Church, when Mysteries of the Church continues in just a moment. The story of the creation of the universe, as told in the book of Genesis, and the same story as viewed from the perspective of pure science, seem to describe entirely different events brought about by entirely different causes. But are they really so different? And how did different people interpret these seemingly irreconcilable views of creation? To answer these questions, we must look closely at some of the ways different individuals and the Catholic Church itself interpret the creation in a way that allows us to reconcile what science tells us with what the Bible tells us.
Creationism and creationists, unfortunately, adhere to an understanding of the Bible that Catholic biblical scholars would identify as fundamentalist. In other words, they're mistaking the literary genres of the material that we read in the Bible, pretending that these documents, which were written many, many centuries ago, can be read just the same way as the ways in which we can read today's newspapers.
It's one of those very difficult questions for some people. If we look to this idea about dinosaurs and human beings existing at the same time, I mean, you might be able to speak to someone who will tell you, dinosaur fossils are just put in there to test our faith. I mean, there literally are some people that are that literalist.
They want a security. They want something solid in terms of their faith, and so they adhere to this idea that we have to take the Bible literally in all of its aspects.
The Church would never forbid a Catholic to hold that position, but we believe that the human mind is itself a gift of God. And among other things, one is able to explore such questions as the age of the universe using human reason.
They become very isolated, and they become difficult to talk to. And if they take the creation stories literally, then there may be a lot of other things that they're taking literally also that could be harmful, and that's not healthy.
I don't think there's any way to argue with a person who holds that position, but in my opinion, it makes God to be a kind of trickster, and I believe that's contrary to what the Catholic Church has always understood God's nature to be.
If we fail to recognize that the Bible is an ancient document, it's going to be impossible for us to retrieve its spiritual significance for us today. In other words, the Bible was never meant to be a science textbook. It was, in fact, meant to be that collection of authoritative testimony to God's revelation, to God's self-disclosure, to God's telling us about the divine will for us, for our relationship to our God and Creator.
But church teaching for the last 100 years has been that we need to interpret the Bible according to the literary form of a particular time, so that we don't look at every detail as absolutely the way it's described. What's important, and what the church has always taught, is that what's contained in the Scripture is what is meant for our salvation.
We as Catholics are saying that every single word of Scripture is true, but it's not scientifically true, but it's true in what matters the most. It's true in what it teaches us, and that truth is it teaches us to rely on this higher power, this personal God who has created us and loves us, and who has given order to our universe.
Well, I think Catholics who struggle, you might say, in that battle between what's in the book of Genesis and what science tells us, I think that we need to recognize again that what we have in Genesis is an expression of faith. And that's what's so remarkable about it, is that in hundreds of years before Christ, the ancient Israelites affirmed this belief in God, that they saw God as the creator. And that's the point of the Genesis story. It's not that everything happened in 6 days or whatever, but rather that it is God who was the creator of this, and that God was already, you might say, leading toward human beings and also toward salvation, that God was going to make human beings his own people.
The Church's position on the origin of the universe is basically to be understood as a religious one. It means that all that is comes ultimately from a loving God, and that all that is moving towards full redemption by that same loving God. There is, in other words, a point to life.
When we look to the writings of Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, he looks towards the book of Genesis quite often, and he's very, very clear in trying to reconcile science and scientific truth with the Bible and its salvific truth.
It would really be a very serious mistake to take the narratives of creation at the beginning of the book of Genesis literally, because to take them literally is to fall into an error that we call fundamentalism, which is an error that involves pretending that the biblical texts were written by contemporary authors, modern authors, and written for modern audiences or modern readers.
We don't ever have this literalist approach to sacred scripture. God uses those people of that particular time period. He inspires them to express the truth as they understand the truth. But we have to understand that when we look to this, the days of creation, the order of creation in sacred scripture, what we're really studying is an allegorical Hebrew cosmology.
So whether you accept Genesis literally or simply as a metaphor for a much greater truth, the most important thing is that you believe it was all done according to God's plan. Stay with us, because in the next segment, we investigate how scientists came to their conclusions about the origins of both the universe and human life, and how their discoveries were influenced by their own belief in God. We have now looked at some of the different views, both biblical and scientific, concerning the creation of the earth and universe. Knowing what the Bible tells us is easy. It is all written down in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. But how did science come to its own particular conclusions on the origins of the cosmos and human life? Who were the men behind these findings? What did they believe? And how does the Church view their work?
Well, of course, the Big Bang Theory is something that I think is generally accepted now by scientists, and would state that this universe began about 13 billion years ago from a very condensed amount of matter, and then which exploded and then gave birth to our universe.
When we look to the idea from Father Georges Lemaitre in the early 20th century, a Jesuit priest who came up with this theory of, based on Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity. Lemaitre's Big Bang theory of this one start is very similar to ultimately what's expressed through divine revelation, okay, in the book of Genesis. And it's what most scientists, most rational people would accept. You know, that in the beginning, there had to be light.
A number of scientists say that immediately after that Big Bang, the balance of atoms was such that that it would lead toward life, which means, therefore, that this was not something just random, that this was something that, in a sense, shows us the wisdom of God, that God intended that this universe would ultimately host life, that life would be possible in this universe. But nevertheless, I think God, in the abundance of His wisdom and splendor, you might say, allowed this evolution to take place, so that we have a witness to God's own majesty, you might say, and God's own wisdom.
There's order. God is the creator. We are the creature. That's the basic truth. And you know what? If we really push ourselves in our science, it's basically the same thing. And we would definitely say, we who are theists, who believe in a higher power, would definitely say that uncaused cause, that unmoved mover, the force behind, beyond that Big Bang Theory, well, that's God.
Some people might well say that it doesn't matter whether you believe in the Big Bang Theory or not. What's important is that you believe in a loving, saving God. In the strictest sense, I would agree with that. I think a thinking, intelligent person today should keep abreast of all the best scientific theories and take a stand according to what he or she believes is the theory that makes the most sense. But that isn't ultimately defining of what it means to be a believing Christian.
When scientists, physicists, astronomers, and so on think about the Big Bang Theory, the theory of how it was that the universe came to be, they talk about an originating moment. The book of Genesis also talks about an originating moment, but it's a different kind of moment that the book of Genesis is talking about, because the book of Genesis is principally concerned with the decision that God makes, with the will of God to bring the universe into being out of nothingness.
There are certainly parallels between the account in the opening lines of the book of Genesis and what is now commonly accepted as the theory of the Big Bang. I myself would somewhat resist presenting the book of Genesis as a kind of anticipation of modern scientific theory.
I think that the Church's teaching authority does not bear upon science, strictly speaking, only insofar as that there might be some conflict that, or perhaps even something in harmony with church teaching. But the authority of the church has to do with revelation and not science as such.
I don't think that the church should give a definitive answer as to whether or not a Catholic must accept the theory of the Big Bang, because that, although the majority of scientists accept that, not all do. That is, in and of itself, a purely scientific question, and that is not an area where a theologian need enter. Our lives count, and that's basically the message of the church about creation. The church would never come to say that one must accept the theory of the Big Bang. Even some scientists disagree with it. That's not a question for religion to solve. But the point of the church's teaching about the creation of the universe is that it does come from a loving, saving God, that there is a point to it all. Our lives are indeed meaningful.
When we look to the writing of a man like Charles Darwin in his Origin of the Species and his other essays, we have to understand that this is not the work of an atheist. This is not the work of a person who's out to say, ha ha ha, now I'm proving that there is no God. This is the work of someone that's a believer.
So how it was that we came to be, that is our evolution from more simple life forms, really doesn't affect the substance of our special relationship with our God.
From 1950 on, in the document, the papal encyclical Humani Generis, Pope Pius XII gave Catholics permission to study the work of Charles Darwin. And among the theories that he proposes really is this theory of evolution, that like everything else in the universe, we grow and we change and we develop.
When we consider the Catholic Church's position with regard to the origin of human beings, there's absolutely nothing wrong with understanding that human beings evolved from simpler life forms.
But the fact that our bodies, even our brains, come from other species before us, that's not a problem for us. Again, it's part of God's marvelous wisdom that He shows His wisdom by this process of evolution.
When one speaks of humans evolving from apes, I personally find that particular terminology tendentious. I prefer the language that humans are related to all living forms of life.
I think that as Catholics we can accept the Darwinian theories that we have evolved from other species before us. What's important is that we recognize, and this is our faith, that our spiritual being, our soul, the most essential part of our being, comes from God.
If we were to look and search and see, okay, let's open up an official text of the Catholic Church and say, what's its official stand on evolution? We're not going to find one, but we're definitely going to see from, just for instance, to use Pope John Paul II, both in 1986 and then later again, and around 1996, he says that evolution is no longer just this scientific theory. It's more or less an accepted part of our concept of reality.
Well, I think that scientists keep discovering new aspects of evolution, new aspects of this cosmos in which we live. So there's constant discoveries, and we're far from finished. So the universe remains a great mystery for us.
So it would seem that most scientists, like the Church, do not find a conflict between their faith and their science. In a moment, we will be back to examine how the Catholic Church reconciles scientific discoveries with our deeply held beliefs. Stay with us as Mysteries of the Church will continue in just a moment. With so many seemingly opposing and contradictory views on how the universe actually began, it is easy for people to become confused about how to separate truth from fiction. The Catholic Church has always sought to guide the faithful along a route which gives them the greatest possible latitude to make decisions which are right for them, while remaining firmly within the framework of church doctrine.
It's important for us to realize that we as Catholics are not biblical fundamentalists. Our understanding of sacred scripture is radically different than a Protestant fundamentalist, an evangelical understanding of sacred scripture.
The Catholic Church is absolutely not in the Dark Ages scientifically. Already centuries ago, there was a wonderful saying by an Italian cardinal named Baronius. The Bible teaches us how to go to heaven and not how the heavens go. And in other words, his point was that the Bible is there to teach religious truth and not scientific truth.
It might surprise some of our viewers to know that there is such a thing as the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which is a group of scientists of various specialties convened together by the Pope himself that represent the best and the brightest of the scientific community in service to the Church and in service to the well-being of humankind. So the Church embraces the conclusions of science and embraces the research of science to help us to fathom the greatness of the God who is the one who brought creation into being and who sustains us in being.
In fact, some of the most important conferences that have been held in recent decades have been held at the Vatican. There, scientists of various religious persuasions have regularly met at the Vatican with theologians and many scientists, among them being Catholics, and have produced a whole series of fascinating volumes on all sorts of questions on the relationship between science and religion.
there are many scientists who are believers. The fact that they are scientists does not take them away from being believers. In fact, sometimes it's their very belief that, you might say, motivates them in the explorations of science.
I would tell someone coming to me who would ask me, can I believe in the Big Bang Theory? Can I believe in the theory of evolution and still remain a faithful, loyal Catholic? The answer to that is yes, as long as we understand that it's ultimately God who creates. It's ultimately God who wills into existence.
If someone is confused about evolution and church doctrine, I would say the important thing is what we say at the beginning of the creed. We believe in God the Father, the creator of heaven and earth. That's the essential aspect of our faith, that God is the creator.
So for a young Catholic who is carrying the Bible and the Catechism in one hand and her science textbook in the other hand, I would urge them to study the book of nature just as intently and just as seriously as they study the book of faith. Because to study the book of nature ultimately is to recognize the God who is revealed in the beauty of God's creation.
The realm of faith and the realm of science are not incompatible for those who believe that God's hand was and remains the guiding force of the universe. Pope John Paul II once said, "Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatory and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish." I'm Carolyn Morrison. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you next time on Mysteries of the Church.